But welcome everybody. Be sure to hit the like button. Be sure to hit the subscribe button.
I remember in middle school when you felt self-conscious if you were the last one to go through puberty. That really went topsy-turvy, didn't it?
Sometimes the house barrage, it's too much explaining yourself and it's too apologetic.
Be sure to hit the notifications bell.
I actually do believe Israel won't just bomb countless civilians.
Be sure to tweet this out. Be sure to put this up on your Facebook.
You have to be kind to people. Be kind to the guys in this mess in the first place.
You can put this up on your Reddit.
Chile is a country.
Be sure to cut and paste, a link to this to go into your favorite Facebook chat group.
It's good to see so many normal people in here.
Now, spanking isn't just my deep, dark personal secret. It's America's deep, dark secret.
I've never seen it explained so simply anywhere.
Put this on WhatsApp. Put this on Telegram. Put this on your favorite messenger app.
Hello and welcome to the Untitled Anarchist Seagull channel. I'm your host, an Untitled Anarchist Seagull called Elise, and yes, it is proper kicking off in LA, has been since yesterday, and apparently the last I heard is it seems like they're going to try to activate the National Guard to get them to start attacking the local communities in addition to the LAPD. Meanwhile, ICE has divided their efforts between, at one point they drove at high speed into a crowd of protesters, seriously injuring at least a couple of people. I haven't heard exact figures on that, though it seemed like everybody was alive. And running away and barricading themselves inside federal buildings, which, I mean, it really kind of shows the shared tactical doctrine between the United States and Israel. Because, I mean, that is the key. We've seen it over and over. That is the IDF power move. That is their signature finishing move when they come up against any kind of actual resistance. They run away. And I ran across this on Twitter. There's all sorts of just remarkable footage. But I did want to share this absolute legend with you before we get started. This is in this is downtown LA. Okay, watch this guy. Watch this skater guy. Here, let me hang on. So I need to make sure I can actually see chat while we full screen videos. Okay, watch this guy in the middle of the screen. No, we missed, we kind of missed it there. Let me start that over. Okay, this guy here in the middle of the screen, watch him. Okay, so they just throw everything at him, and he doesn't flinch, he just walks off and flips them off. So, I mean, I don't know. That stuff actually hurts. I mean, they're shooting pepper balls, they're shooting gas grenades, all, fucking rubber-coated steel bullets, things like that. All kinds of things. That stuff hurts. I mean, I don't know if he's got some sort of body armor under there or something, but he did not show. He didn't seem like physically impressed by the experience, and then he just walks off and flips them off. I just thought I would share that with you. And it just happens that in my recommendations, I saw this video that just came out, and it just seems so fitting, because we're already seeing it, but we're going to see more and more of it. Counterinsurgency. And a lot of people don't really get what counterinsurgency is. They think about it in terms of like actual, sort of kinetic repression and stuff like that. But that is but one aspect of it, and it is actually one of the less effective aspects of it. So we have a short introduction to counterinsurgency And I thought we might have a look at this and see if it's any good. This is with Jared Ware from Millennials Are Killing Capitalism, which, if you aren't watching that, that is definitely worth watching.
Thank you.
This is apparently a Swedish channel called Frihetsarna, which is like disturbers of
Hello.
the peace.
Welcome, Jared. I actually don't know your last name.
My last name is Ware.
Okay.
Yeah.
For me,
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for.
I mean, he has all sorts of really interesting people on, and they generally have excellent conversations on all sorts of useful and beautiful things, including stuff about counterinsurgency. So he's going to be talking about counterinsurgency, and I think that is definitely going to be worth checking out.
Accepting my invite and joining us to explain some difficult concepts today. I'm just gonna try and pin you here, which is weirdly difficult. Alright, I'm gonna do this instead.
Okay, we don't need to watch him getting hung.
Sorry about that. For me, your last name is Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. That's where I know you from. I've been following your podcast for, I don't know, almost 2 years now. I think for me it started after the genocide started. But you've been going on for 8 years?
Yeah, he's been going on for a while.
Yeah.
And he's on YouTube. I'm going to drop that link here real quick. Because if you're not watching Millennials Are Killing Capitalism, hello, Mask of the Red Death. It's definitely worth checking out. Let me see. Yeah, there we go. We got a link here. Excellent. Linkadresse kopieren. Oh, that is a wonderfully long link there. But yeah, I mean, definitely a channel worth checking out.
That's to follow for me, because it dives deep into topics that you normally don't hear elsewhere, or angles that you don't hear elsewhere. But with that said, would you like to introduce yourself a bit so that people know you better?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I mean, first of all, thank you for having me on. I'm looking forward to this conversation with you. It's certainly a dark time that we are in right now, and I think one
on so many
few
levels.
things that gives me some joy is just to be in conversation with people and to talk through things, and so I appreciate the invitation. So I host the Millennials Are Killing Capitalism live streams on YouTube. And then my partner, Josh Briand, and I have been running Millennials Are Killing Capitalism as an audio podcast going back to the fall of 2017. And, at the time that we created it, we just felt like there was a void in terms of media.
Thank you, Mask of the Red Death. A much cleaner link there.
In the United States that was anti-imperialist. And this was at a time when there was also an upsurge in what wouldn't be left-wing politics in Sweden, but for the United States with our
You mentioned Sweden.
fascistic and right.
If you're just getting here, he's mentioning Sweden because this is a Swedish YouTube channel. It's called Frihetsarna.
Right-wing kind of political economy. Something like Bernie Sanders represented really something that was outside of the norm of politics in the United States in 2016 with the presidential run that he had. And so with that moment, there were some different things that were happening. I mean, one was there was a lot of work.
I mean, it's perhaps it is in the global north, but in most of the world, it is not actually really a tendency identifier. I mean, it's true that, in the imperial core in, like, the US, Canada, Western Europe, that often tends to identify specific tendencies, but in the places that are bearing the brunt of imperialism, it's just a shared view. I mean, the idea of like a sort of the pro-US left that exists, or like pretends to exist in places like the US, is kind of anathema out, you know, when you get outside of the sort of bubble
that the ruling class also did to kind of, you know, there's a way in which he was elevated as a candidate, and then a way that his candidacy was also used to tell people that they were kind of ridiculous. And so there was a term called Bernie Bros that was thrown around a lot, which was basically this.
I'm going to skip forward a little bit because this is actually going to be an introduction to counterinsurgency, and I'm kind of interested in getting specifically into that. Because, I mean, I haven't heard him specifically talk on counterinsurgency, but he's generally very worth listening to, and probably at the very least a good way to start the conversation. I mean, that's only true as long as you limit the field to the global north. I mean, that's the only place where that is actually in any way a distinguishing factor, and where
they have been fantastic. And you also had other people talking about Palestine and giving some historical and contemporary background to a deeper analysis to all of that.
I mean, it predates Stalin, it's worth noting. I mean, the term was already being used in the late 19th century, albeit in a liberal sense. There was a liberal anti-imperialist movement right in the United States in the late 19th century. Mark Twain was part of it. It would not be anti-imperialism in any sense that we would recognize it, but they were already using the term.
It's happening.
Yeah, I would just say quickly, just in response to that, you know, people have been very generous over the years with their time with us. And I think in the beginning of doing a podcast, you know, it can be even intimidating to reach out to certain people. And it wasn't really until 2020 exceptions that I think are just morally and totally bankrupt. And as Orasami Burton, someone who I've had a number of conversations with as well, you know, I'm kind of paraphrasing here, but these are people with a very cynical and...
Yeah, but my point is, the concept was already around. So not everyone who identifies anti-imperialism as part of their politics is necessarily getting it from Mao or Stalin. Mao or Stalin were kind of late to that, and were certainly not the only ones representing it in their time. Or even necessarily, in the case of Stalin, not even particularly well representing it.
Kind of pessimistic view of human nature, you know, and so there are people who think that essentially anyone who wants to improve their society through any means other than just going to the ballot box, however frequently your country has elections, is a potential enemy of the state.
Okay, it sounds like we're getting to the actual counterinsurgency bit. This is what I wanted to talk about for reasons that I think anyone who's seen what's going on in LA right now, but not just LA, other stuff, I mean, throughout the US at the moment, will...
So there's a lot of different
I think,
ways to talk about it, and it's hard to pin down because counterinsurgents themselves have different definitions of these things. What I would say is that there's a blending of the ideas of an insurgent and the ideas of a subversive, and that they don't know where these things sort of begin, how they develop and how they end, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an important point. We often kind of talk about the sort of repressive institutions, spy services, cops, or whatever. They will often be talked about as if they were somehow omniscient or something like that, or just because they were listening in on us or something, that they actually understood what they were hearing. And the thing is, that the thing is that actually understanding the nature of the thing that they're against is actually an ideological impossibility for them. And because the whole enterprise of counterinsurgency is very much an ideological enterprise. The entire apparatus around it is very much ideological, and no matter how much raw data they get, the conclusions they reach as to what's important, what anything means, and everything like that, comes very much from that sort of ideological framing that they exist within. I mean, a good example of this is why Israel, despite actually having some intelligence indicating that an offensive was going to be happening in October of 2023, did not actually do anything out of the ordinary. Basically just did business as usual. And the thing is, part of their ideological framing is that they're here, and therefore there was no reason to believe that anyone could possibly catch them by surprise, that nobody was ever going to catch them out, and that in any case they are fundamentally superior to their adversaries. And so when the offensive happened, they absolutely were totally unprepared for it, ideologically unprepared, much as was the case actually as well in 1973. And we see examples of this over and over again. I mean, it's interesting if you read the literature of, now there is like an academic discipline of intelligence studies. That's a post 9/11 thing. And one of the things that is talked about in the introductions of the books on intelligence studies is intelligence failures. And the examples they give are examples where you can totally see where the issue fundamentally was they were ideologically predisposed to look in the wrong place. Like the big one was the collapse of the Soviet Union that they didn't see coming. Also, like, the Soviet Union didn't really see it coming either, for much the same reason, because everybody was concerned about looking towards the top of organizational structures and not really putting their ears on the bottom, where things were starting to kick off in various ways. So, and the thing is, what's fascinating about the literature of intelligence failures and stuff like that is that none of the authors of these like scholarly studies seem to have noticed that this was the problem, even though they themselves point out, yeah, I mean, the whole strategy is you look at what the top level decision makers are doing, and you make your analysis of what's going on in the area of interest based on that, and it never occurs to them, apparently, that that's the problem.
And so
that should be reassuring to us. Just because they see things going on and hear things going on does not mean they comprehend anything.
Become fearful constantly. This is counterinsurgents. They become fearful constantly that any form of political action could lead to revolution, essentially. And some of us might say, well, that's not such a bad thing. But
yeah, I imagine some of us watching might say that.
A really important, I guess, starting point to understand is that the whole field of counterinsurgency is premised on the idea that the existing order in the world or within a nation state is fundamentally better than an alternative that could be created through an organic movement within that, whether within the world or within a nation state. And so a lot of this literature is written by imperialists. So a lot of it is also written by specifically like, and it's a weird, I should say, like to go to terms too. So a counterinsurgent could be a military official.
Yeah, in fact, actually, when you look at police counterinsurgency tactics in the U.S. these days, a lot of them are taken directly from the military literature of counterinsurgency. And it's worth noting, those manuals, a lot of them, those Army manuals are available online for free as PDFs. You can look at them. You can actually see what the tactics are that the military advises based on their attempts to sort of calm people down in territories they're occupying.
Militaries they study this stuff all the time. They have classes on it. When you go through the military, if you're put into a specific field, you'll be trained in it.
Interestingly, one military that doesn't have this stuff, that doesn't really put any, they have an alternative name for something that is supposedly the same thing, but really isn't, is Israel. For the simple reason that they're not really looking to calm the Palestinians down. They're looking to just have no Palestinians. So what the hell, what's the point of calming them down?
And so again, this is like a very normative thing on a lot of levels. But there's also people within the academy who study it, and sometimes they have direct relationships with the military. Sometimes they have relationships with think tanks or, aspects of what we call the military-industrial complex. Sometimes they might be in the FBI or they might be private contractors, right? So it's a big world, but it's one of the most common forms of warfare that's fought in, since World War II.
Yeah. And also, really often one of the less successful ones.
Where the war itself doesn't rise to the level where it's like World War II, where you have a whole bunch of nation states coming together and directly fighting one another, right?
Another term in this context is low-intensity conflict, which is sort of, a term that, as far as I know, was like coined by Frank Kitson, a brigadier in the British Army and a real shithead who did all sorts of horrible shit in Yemen and then later in Ireland and I believe in Kenya as well, and talked about his experiences doing it and what sort of lessons that those experiences bore for people who are looking to maintain control over territory they've stolen.
So a lot of this is like sort of lessons that are learned by, Europe, the United States, maybe Japan, you could throw different countries in this. After World War I and World War II, which were tremendously costly for Europe in terms of human lives, countries being transformed for the worse, for the better in some cases, maybe afterwards, that they really want to avoid these types of massive conflicts. But then they have the realities of the Cold War, and so they're not trying to avoid conflict totally. A lot of the earlier counterinsurgency wars come out of anti-colonial movements. They come in response to it.
And this is where the concept of low-intensity conflict comes out, which is kind of
the West trying to ensure that countries that move on, become independent post-colonialism, stay within the Western capitalist camp. And then on the flip side, the Soviet Union, China, etc., are also trying to spread socialism, communism through, diplomatic means and offering an alternative form of developmental path. But also, there's military conflicts that happen because, people, take Vietnam, take Korea, right? People choose to take a side of saying, we want to follow a socialist path, and the West, usually the United States, led at this point, saying, we'll fight you, we'll kill as many of your people as possible. And so, I think that's important to sort of add. I know that I'm kind of going.
I'm gonna skip ahead again because what I want to get into more than anything is actually I'm hoping he's going to be talking about the sort of techniques that we actually see. I mean, an example that I've seen. I mean, this is sort of a very common thing. Liberals had they did this to try to take the wind out of the 2020 uprising against racist police terror, where they just sort of assumed and claimed with no evidence that anything that was popping off, that was actually just like one random right-wing white guy doing it. Or they would be like, look at all these bricks, there's a whole pile of cinder blocks mysteriously outside Home Depot or at a building site. Clearly, this is a false flag. And it's like, this sort of bullshit, in order to, it's starting again. There's one of these right-wing streamers, calls himself an independent journalist in LA, shows footage of some fucking cinder blocks at a building site, and he's like, yeah, clearly, look, the cops are doing this as a false flag, and it's like, well, first, somebody pointed out quite correctly that cinder blocks are not easy to throw. That's not bricks. That's not stones. Those things, if you can throw that shit, you are, with any kind of accuracy and any kind of distance, you should be, an Olympic hopeful.
As Orsami Burton would say, is they're just lying to you, and you have to parse it out. So it's
and not easy to grip.
All of this is a difficult literature to read because there's just a lot going on, and these people at the end of the day are, just kind of full of shit, and
that is one of the things that a lot of the most important literature on this is written by, the enemy, really, and it is written by just really shitty people who, with all sorts of really shitty ideological assumptions about what they're doing, and they think that whatever it is they're doing, which is generally war crimes, is wonderful, and they have often an extremely condescending, very racist analysis of the people that they're targeting with their counterinsurgency operations, and a sense of entitlement to, rule over them and all sorts of stuff, which does make it really hard. You have to constantly sift through that shit to get at the things that are actually quite important in understanding how the other side thinks about these things.
But Kitson, Malaysia.
Yeah, Frank Kitson.
Or Malaya in that period. Kenya. I think maybe a little bit of involvement in Cyprus, and then Northern Ireland. So he writes the Low Intensity Operations is the name of the book that Orsami and I did a 2-part discussion
on. I picked it up at an anarchist book fair in London years ago.
And
you can also get it cheap for Kindle. I imagine I would not be shocked at all if there's a PDF of it, and it is worth reading. It's a short read, and it is a good introduction to how the people we're dealing with think about the task of dealing with us.
Yeah, that's an important book. Within this kind of genre, I would say a lot of what he has to say, the field manual is not that different, is part of what I would say. The field manual is different in terms of it's, written, 30, 35 years, something like that later. It's a little bit more updated. It's a little bit more attentive to kind of defining and talking about the forms of propaganda and media operations and psychological warfare.
Another really interesting piece of counterinsurgency literature, though it doesn't completely rise to the level of scholarship. I remember there was this leak of this it's got to be like 10 years ago now, maybe a little bit more, of this consultancy firm whose thing is that they work with chemical companies and companies that run into problems, run into objections from environmentalists and consumer safety advocates and whatever. And it talks about the strategy and how the key is that they say there are three kinds of people in every one of these groups. You've got the extremists, who you will never ever manage to win over to your side. And then you've got the opportunists, and then you've got these people in the middle, and the idea is to turn the opportunists, win over the opportunists, to turn the people in the middle against the extremists and get them on your side without them realizing that they're actually doing your work for them. You could call it outside tranquilizers.
Here, and again, like, yeah, you know, I sound like the tinfoil hat guy right now, but like, they just talk about this stuff. They're not shy about it.
Very openly.
And if I remember correctly, you mentioned that the latest document, the field manual, was written together with contributions from people from Atlantic and academics, and it wasn't just the army just making shit up. It was
so they do at Fort Leavenworth, I believe it was, they had a conference where they brought together, and this is something Dylan Rodriguez, initially was the person who drew me to this, because he and I had more discussion about the field manual. And he's the person who actually first told me that, you should read this, because in his book, White Reconstruction, he uses it to talk about actually diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, which is maybe something we could talk about at some point. But
here, I'm dropping the link to the counterinsurgency field manual as PDF here.
Afghanistan and Iraq are wars that the United States is fighting at this time. Petraeus.
And a lot of counterinsurgency doctrine. And specifically, the counterinsurgency doctrine we see on the streets right here. The cops do. Remember when the cops were taking a knee in front of protesters back in 2020? Taking a knee in like solidarity with the people their own colleagues were killing, and then and completely like mentally disarming protesters, and the protesters thought that this was gonna, some of the liberal protesters thought that this was gonna be a really warm moment or something like that, and then the minute they approached, the cops kicked the fuck out of them. I mean, you don't find this stuff at that level of granularity in these manuals, but you find the seed of ideas like
that. This like Princeton educated general. This guy, David Kilcullen, who is an Australian counterinsurgent, which is very interesting, sort of, because all Australia does is support counterinsurgency campaigns, really. Like, it doesn't fight wars, or I'm not saying it wouldn't ever, but it doesn't, like, declare war on some place. And
and it's always on somebody else's behalf. Every war Australia's been in, either Britain told them to join in, or the U.S. did. They've never, except for the wars against their own indigenous population, though actually, they were doing that literally directly on behalf of Britain. But to the extent that they do anything outside of Australia, it is pretty much always at the behest of either Britain or the U.S., and it is pretty much always counterinsurgency, except for the two world wars.
Fight it, right? It sends officers and troops and stuff to help support other campaigns, and largely to help other governments in their region put down insurgencies. And so Kilcullen is one of the co-authors of it as well.
And East Timor.
Which I also think is interesting, because it's a U.S. manual, but you have this Australian that's written a lot of it. It's also important that these are both settler colonies, right? And settler colonialism is really...
and Australians, they're Yanks who know cricket, let's be honest.
Important to counterinsurgency literature as well. But the process, they bring together a whole bunch of people.
If Jinjiri shows up for that, I'm sure we will get interesting comments in the chat. Oh, that's why I was like, wait a second. There's an Australian who watches this stream occasionally, Jinjiri, and I'm like, it would be my luck if I said that and Jinjiri shows up in the chat.
I always love to point out the Atlantic thing because they are, in my view, the most counterinsurgent.
There's a classic Aussie band from the 1970s, 1980s called Red Gum. Did lots of protest songs and things like that, and they did a parody of the Beach Boys song Surfin' USA called Servin' USA.
Publication in the United States.
Tell Malkin we're serving USA.
Even more than, like, I mean, the New York Times is right there too, but the Atlantic has a very specific way of always telling people that they're too radical and trying to beat them over the head for being too radical.
I mean, unless they're being radical about not wanting trans people to exist, in which case suddenly they're not radical enough.
So yeah, the Atlantic reported about it in really glowing terms, and
which is how you know it's bad. When the Atlantic is really excited about something, it's probably shit.
What a great forum it was for the exchange of ideas between journalists and military and human rights organizations and academics.
Human rights organizations too.
And
why,
so yeah,
why am I not? Why would I?
And those are the forces, like. And this is not to say that everybody that's involved in journalism or everybody that's involved in academia or, it's not a conspiracy.
No. I mean, for one thing, a conspiracy's in secret. And the people who get involved in this shit are doing it right out in the open. They're publishing under their names. You can read them. If you can read, if you can read their publications, it isn't a conspiracy. It's just they're just openly doing it and hoping that nobody.
Just that there are a set or a group of people who see shared interests in like U.S. hegemony for the U.S. counterinsurgency field manual, and almost every country has some version of this for their own their own people.
I mean, Chile is interesting in that they are so completely under the U.S.'s thumb when it comes to just about anything to do with military activities, and yet they have learned nothing from like U.S. counterinsurgency manual. They like literally the carabineros, the Paco Culiao, the military police who you will run into on the streets and at every protest. Nobody has ever taught them about how you can, like, blunt a movement through de-escalation tactics. All they know is beat people over the head with sticks and shoot grenades at them. They literally are incapable of de-escalation. It is anathema to them. They haven't even heard of it.
They see shared interests in the existing order and believe in defending it, and so they actually agree to sort of work together on, on these campaigns. And what might that look like? It might look like a military operation here, an op-ed, supporting that here, and it's not like these people do it because they believe in it, I mean, I think Noam Chomsky had this interview at one point where he interviews this, like, journalist or whatever, and he's like, I believe in what I do.
Oh, yeah, this was on Channel 4 in Britain. It was a great interview because the journo was so offended by the idea of the media falling within a propaganda model because he genuinely believes the stuff that he says. And Chomsky's just like, yeah, and if you didn't believe it, you wouldn't be sitting here talking with me right now.
I'm not lying. And Chomsky says something along the lines of, like, I know you do, because if you didn't, you wouldn't be sitting where you're sitting right now.
Yeah.
Like, the reason that you have that job and that you do what you do is because you believe in this stuff.
Exactly.
And I think that's a really important thing for people to understand is it's...
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things that doesn't get talked about as much when it comes to the propaganda model is there's a whole section in that book that I think probably does not need much updating, if any, compared to a lot of the others, which things have become in some respects more sophisticated. It's a bit more complicated. The basic ideas certainly hold, but there's a whole section on the filters, the sort of ideological filters that ensure that the people who actually get to have a media platform in the first place and get to be in a position to be influential in that way are going to be people who already have the right ideas and don't need to be told to say something.
It's not, some nefarious conspiracy where everybody has dirt on each other, or, J. Edgar Hoover has pictures of people, like that could be part of it. But for the most part, it's people who actually really believe in what they're doing. And so they think of themselves as acting in the public good, on the right side of history, and so on.
I mean, and that is actually a more grotesque thought than anything. I mean, just imagine to think that Jake Tapper believes in what he's doing. It's like, wow, you gotta really suck as a human to believe in what Jake Tapper is doing.
And they really believe in, an NFL analogy probably won't make sense to your audience, but there's this term in the NFL of protect the shield or defend the shield, which is the symbol of the UFL or the NFL. So anyways, the point just being of these are people who would proudly chant the Pledge of Allegiance to the United States of America every day if they were asked to, and so, I guess that's...
Or if they don't, they would make a point of talking about what a great country it is that you have the option of not swearing a loyalty oath to the flag.
An important point to bring in, but there's a lot of cross collaboration, and so you will see sometimes when you see that article online that everybody's raging against that feels really messed up,
it's weird to say this in the singular. At any given time, there are probably 20.
If we just think about, again, Gaza, you think about how complicit the U.S. media and probably most of the Western media has been in everything that has gone on, and how they report it, what they don't report, that these are decisions, and I'm sure for certain journalists that work for these outlets that want to be able to tell the truth, it is deeply frustrating, and some of them quit, and some of them lose their minds and whatever.
Yeah, I mean, which is sort of another kind of filter. I mean, that you have a situation where people just can't take it, and, when things do shift in a way where now people are being expected to do something they really had not been prepared for when they signed on, a lot of them just leave, and so you end up with people who are cool with it.
But at an editorial level, at the level of the institutions, it's not that difficult for them because they believe that they're defending Western civilization or something like this by reporting in the way that they are.
Yeah, no, I agree. I try to also keep...
Or they're convinced that what they're doing is genuinely objective, and that theirs is the only... I mean, that they aren't even... I mean, I would imagine a lot of them would be actually shocked to be confronted with the idea that they have even that level, that kind of a macro level agenda. In many cases, they probably are convinced that by throwing in weasel words and saying things like Hamas-run health ministry or whatever like that, and putting in both sides, even when one side is demonstrably lying, that they are doing objective journalism. They're just doing the thing, and they're doing it right. And to do it any other way would mean you had an agenda, but because they do it this way, that's the proof that they don't have an agenda. And a lot of them are probably very convinced of that. Because, I mean, people are very good at bullshitting themselves.
Focus when people talk about, they're infiltrated, they're paid, whatever. I mean, maybe early on, but we're
I mean, there are literally cases of, journalists and academics being paid and stuff like that. I mean, that was one aspect of Iran-Contra. There was a whole thing, this group, it's something, Information Statecraft Project, run by the Ministry of Defense in Britain, and one of their things was, supporting certain journalists and promoting their work, and, sort of smearing others, based on the idea that, if you're not promoting the sort of official line on various things, then it's Russian disinformation, don't you know?
Point where the ideological hegemony, it just repeats itself. I mean, it just reproduces itself. So these people don't need to be paid anymore. They're already indoctrinated, and they just keep on because they think this is the right thing. As you say, they've already bought the supremacy. So, and they're part of it. So, I mean, if there's sort of a benefit.
Yes, that's right. Thank you. They definitely did. I mean, and there was, around COINTELPRO that existed. I mean, this stuff is probably as old as journalism when you get down to it. And mostly has to, I mean, there's a guy just recently, a few years ago, this one guy, I think he was writing for the LA Times at the time, just sort of let slip that actually he was on the CIA payroll, and he lost that job. But you can still find him on Twitter accusing other people of being in the pay of nefarious institutions to spread disinformation. I forget the guy's name.
Calculation. They are benefiting from it, and they know it. So most of the time.
Yeah, I mean, there is a benefit for sure, and they are usually paid, but it's not like it's not like a bribe. It's
no, I meant more like it's the status, like the
yeah.
This is, I believe in supremacy, and I
probably. Although I would also say, I mean, if he were working for the CIA and not on the payroll, he probably would still have the job, even if he did sort of reveal that much. But employers like to know that they have the full loyalty of their employees.
I am supreme, so that's the benefit, I guess. But I don't want people to get the idea that this is about only. So we've been talking about colonialism, we've been talking about militaries, but it's not necessarily about militaristic adventures or like some other country. Can we sort of turn that into how would this be applied, or has this been applied domestically?
Okay, this is what I'm here for.
Yeah. So Mark Neoclis is we had a conversation with him on his recent book, Pacification. And, pacification is another kind of synonym for counterinsurgency, and it actually goes...
Another one of the older ones, like the counterinsurgency campaign during the conquest of Mapuche territory in the 19th century in what is now called Chile, was called La Pacificación de la Araucanía, the pacification of Araucanía, which is their name for the region.
Back further in terms of people talked about pacification long
before. Like Mark Twain talked about pacification as an example of a grotesque euphemism, I seem to remember.
Or they started using the term counterinsurgency. And for Mark, for Professor Neoclis, he basically argues that this goes way back, that that Rome and
I think it might have been around the U.S. campaign against the Philippines in like 1899, 1900. I feel like that would have been that, because I know he wrote against that, and I feel like at some point he said something about like how grotesque the term pacification is.
In Greece to some extent, but definitely by the time you get to Rome, that they're very they're thinking a lot about like what we would call today counterinsurgency. And I think Orasami Burton has talked about this a lot too.
I mean, I would say everybody who's ever tried to exercise power over other people has had some sort of thoughts on something that is at the very least related to it.
About and he also works with Neoclis's thought around it of like it's not that there's war that goes on in, foreign, and that domestic there's something else, or that, it's that these societies are fundamentally built liberalism, really, as a system. And I don't mean like
if you're just joining, because I just noticed a significant influx just now, we're looking at a talk. This is a channel called Fredhetsarna. This is a bit different than what we usually do. This is actually, I'm watching this because I think it's because I think it's probably going to be good. This Swedish channel called Fredhetsarna is talking with Jared Ware of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism on the subject of counterinsurgency, which I thought would be a topical thing to be looking at for reasons.
I'm a Democrat, or I'm a Republican, or I'm a social democrat, or whatever. I mean, like, political liberalism, the idea of, rights, individual liberty, private property, these kind of ideas. That it is constantly, even when you read the people who wrote this, whether it's like Thomas Hobbes or John Locke or whatever, these kind of theorists, that they're constantly thinking about enemies within and about
I mean, sometimes on the theory that literally everybody is somehow the enemy within, just by a conception of human nature.
Social wars, they want to avoid. This is something Nicholas talks about a lot. Is like they want to avoid civil war at all costs, which again is kind of that.
Okay, the name Nicholas immediately makes me think ancient Greek philosopher somehow. I'm wondering how he's spelling that.
World War I comment too is like, you want to avoid something where you could see millions of brothers and sisters like fighting each other.
Yeah, I was specifically thinking about Hobbes when I said that. I mean, his whole thing is basically the idea that if we don't have this like state apparatus, everybody's just going to be fucking, everybody's going to be just beating the shit out of each other and eating each other and everything. Like, if like every single John Galt, Fountainhead, libertarian, intentional community ends up being 5 minutes after the last bag of Doritos gets eaten up and nobody knows how to do anything because it is a group of people who have literally no fucking skills except for self-aggrandizement.
But in order to do that, they believe that you have to constantly have these kind of, again, wars against internal enemies. And to give examples of what that looks like, I mean, so it could be Muslims, it could be immigrants, it could be black people, it could be indigenous folks, it could be also like kind of moral panic stuff of like, whether it's sex criminals or homeless folks or whatever is
trans people. We have an acute turf shortage or something.
Societies are, you just watch the news, right? And it's like, what in the news are they telling you today is the thing that you have to be concerned about within your city or your state? And that
this is one of the things I have to say. Oh, I agree. It is absolutely a surfeit of turfs. This is a thing that they did, I thought, quite well in Series 2 of Andor. I'm not going to try to do spoilers, but the whole way they talk about the sort of counterinsurgency propaganda operation they're doing about the Gormans, to create sort of a moral panic around the Gormans to justify like destroying their planet because they want certain minerals off it, I thought was really well done.
You a good idea of what is being demonized for this kind of warfare, because I mean, and this is,
and it was so fitting that they decided, since you have that scene where it's like the two PR guys are pitching this thing to the imperial bureaucrats, and they're like, you know how everyone sort of, you know how Gormans always seem like they have a little chip on their shoulder? Yeah, that was us. And then they decide, and then the writers or whoever made this decision decided to have their language sound like French, while not being anything French, except like purely by happenstance. Like the word valley sounds almost like the French word for it. Was really quite fitting there.
The United States is a supremely violent state, more so than a lot of other places. We have a lot more, gun deaths and things like that than most places. But it's in the United States. It's very telling every day. They lead with a shooting, they lead with a this, and they show you the pictures of the suspects and so on. And it's all a process of trying to get people kind of primed.
El enemigo interno. The enemy within. And one of the really interesting things, maybe he's going to touch on this at some point. I have not seen this. I just had this on my mind to look at for this stream. Nous sommes les gars. Wait. There have been studies to look at like people's fear of crime versus their likelihood of actually experiencing being a victim of it. And it turns out the likelihood of actually being victimized by violent crime is completely decoupled from fear of being a victim of violent crime. The people who are most likely to think that they're likely to be a victim of violent crime are people who watch a lot of the news. And most of those people tend to be in demographics that are extremely unlikely to ever be victims of violent crime.
And accepting of a war that is not really about that individual person or that individual actor, but a type of policing and, which is to say a form of warfare really against a group of people. And so it's, and this is, again, it starts to sound a little bit conspiratorial.
I mean, in Chile, they copied the U.S. so much on that they actually used McGruff, the crime dog. I forget what they called him. They may have just called him Magruff or something like that. I don't remember. But they literally copied that with the Fundación Paz Ciudadana, the Civil Peace Foundation, which is all about giving the cops more weapons and more powers to bust heads in working class communities.
Whatever. It's also something that counterinsurgents talk about a lot. So they think about the domestic arena as connected to the foreign arena. So again, just to use an example for the United States, just for ease for me, right now, we see students on visas that are here to study getting pulled off the street and getting thrown into cages because they wrote an op-ed.
Yeah. Oh, that reminds me. You weren't here. I talked about this a bit yesterday because I was looking. I went down this rabbit hole, and studies of Jewish public opinion because somebody had asked for confirmation of a figure about support of the genocide by Jews in the U.S. And the short version, I go through what I actually found of recent studies, which is that they did not even ask the question. They never straight up asked. But one thing I found just by pure happenstance is it was the AJC's 2023 study on anti-Semitism, where one of the things they ask is, do you consider, and this is all Jewish respondents, do you consider anti-Semitism a problem on college campuses? And unlike their study of Jewish public opinion generally, they have the stratification by age shown. So you can see the difference between the 18 to 25s and everybody else. And here's the thing. The 25 to 40s and the 40s to 600 or whatever the fuck, I don't remember the exact stratification, they overwhelmingly say, yes, it's clearly a problem. And the 18 to 25s, i.e. the ones who are most likely to actually have been on a campus in the past 24 hours, 2/3 of them say, no, it's not a thing.
Or because they showed up to a protest. And these are things that through any regular, even through our own constitution in the United States, there's nothing that says that people can't do this stuff. And typically, as a result, they do end up getting released, but
yeah,
in the meantime, their lives get messed up. They become, maybe will have difficulty getting jobs.
I mean, unless, of course, liberals decide to start playing Junior G-Man on social media because they want to identify the outside agitators who, like, set fire to a bin or something. Ja, das kann man so ziemlich jeden Tag sagen. And they'll be like, well, we gotta identify this person. And then it turns out, oh, it's the girlfriend of the guy the cops just murdered. And now she's going to jail for 10 years. Good job. Good job, libs. I mean, that whole thing. I mean, could we please, since we seem to be getting into this cycle of quantitatively and qualitatively escalating mass popular working class militancy in the U.S., seems to be having another little iteration right now. Thank fuck. I was hoping we'd see it soon, but could we just have just a general agreement that we just nip that bullshit in the bud? Like, isolate anyone who starts doing that shit if they won't listen and understand why they should not be doing that. Because that is a movement-killing thing.
People, maybe they won't be able to finish their degrees, or they'll be traumatized, or they're thrown in cages and tortured and all kinds of stuff, And so there's, that's just like one example, but it's because to the state, they see that internal stuff, even those very small level things, as connected to a military campaign that they're trying to win. And
yes, and here we go with Andor again. This is, Andor is so good on so many things, and that whole speech Partagaz gives, who I had remembered as Clarence, the news director who turns out to be a Soviet agent on The Hour from, I think it was ITV, several years before that, and he has this whole thing. No, Dedra, that's not what we're about. We are in the business of healthcare, and he goes this whole thing about we're identifying symptoms and all this shit. And it is, and the thing is, it's like when you listen to that, it seems like the writers might have actually spent some time reading the sort of theory where it would, like the ruling class version of the sort of theory we're talking about here, because when you listen to, like, when you read a academic treatment of counterintelligence theory, which I have, or an academic treatment of intelligence analysis, you hear that analogy all the time, where you're looking for symptoms, you're trying to connect like two potentially unrelated events in order to see if you've got an overall condition or whether it's a zit or whatever. They did so many things well in Andor. It is amazing that thing got made. It is amazing that thing got made by fucking Disney, especially. I have this idea for a series of video essays that are like lessons, essentially sort of lessons we can learn from Andor, because I think there actually are some really, there are things that you can use to start an educational kind of conversation about a lot of things in there. And it's the trouble is I don't know where to start, because there's so much stuff that is done so well that you could use for that.
It's the same in the United States of, like, if there's internal protests or, like, Black Lives Matter or Standing Rock in the United States, when
with Standing Rock, people often forget this. Because it wasn't the major focus of a lot of the discussion around, like, Russiagate and stuff in 2016, 2017. But Standing Rock was fingered in this, like, report that is supposedly authoritative on Russian interference. Standing Rock and the No Dapple protests was, like, portrayed as a Russian influence operation. Oh god, I hate fucking choppers. Like, how high was it flying? Was this shit falling off of your wall, or was this you can vaguely hear propellers?
Indigenous people were trying to...
The only chopper I like is the one that you can use the cheat code for in GTA 5. I mean, spending a month in Echo Park in LA where the LAPD buzz people's houses on the regular really cured me of any affection for the helicopter form.
Defend their land against the pipeline that they didn't want. That all these different forces get deployed from, military, military contractors, policing agencies, FBI, and then also the media to do different types of demonization and things like this. And
yeah, and it's often one of the things that I think people often get confused about is sometimes people expect the demonization to be of like an entire protest, and so it catches them off guard when counterinsurgency propaganda embraces certain aspects of a protest and demonizes certain other aspects, because they have this idea that the other side is just going to demonize the whole thing, and oh look, we've got through to the media, we've broken through melted the hard candy shell of their heart, and we have found our place in the cool milk chocolate on the inside of why am I making their hearts into M&Ms? I don't actually know, but when actually what's going on there is an attempt to divide the fucking movement. East Oakland. Oh yeah, I mean, it is unbearable, I would have to say, because they're just very clearly doing it at a certain altitude to make sure, because they've realized they can make their presence known. It is a way to just say, we're here and we're going to fuck with you. And there's not a whole lot you can do about it because we're, 100 feet up or whatever. God.
So,
hate that shit.
It's really kind of the United States uses the term full spectrum dominance, which is like...
which is not looking like it's working very well at the moment. Can't even manage, partial spectrum dominance of the Red Sea.
Dominate from outer space all the way, down to the ground level. And it's kind of like that of just that they see all these different spheres where they need to engage in struggle. One of those being the narrative sphere, which is like the media, and then there's the political, there's the court systems, there's the military, and all of these things need to be working in alignment. And I should say there is always contestation within all of these spaces too, because it's not everybody is going to agree. Not everybody has this.
I mean, one of the things I have to say I appreciate about Jared is that he is not actually afraid of acknowledging complexity in basically everything that he's talking about. It makes the conversations much more interested and much more layered.
Vision, in the United States, it is true that there are spaces where Democratic, Party members and Republican Party members will disagree with each other most often when it's convenient for them, because I can make my party look good by fighting you on this specific thing right now. And so you do see contestation within these spaces too, but there is nonetheless always these kind of coordinated campaigns that happen.
Yeah, and this idea that they have to constantly do this, it doesn't cease, it's always there.
Gonna skip ahead again because we've only got 10-15 minutes left, and I want to see if we get into more specific topics. But this looks like a really good... I'm gonna drop the link again for anyone in chat who didn't get it earlier, because this looks well worth watching. I've never heard of the channel this is on, but the guy that he's interviewing there is Jared Ware from Millennials Are Killing Capitalism, and that is well worth watching. Has very interesting people on there.
China, but these countries are sort of decimated, and so there's the Marshall Plan. They have to kind of come into more of the orbit of the West, and there's a lot of buildup of different principled political ideological disagreements, and some of it is just not ultimately, and whether it is principled or not, sometimes it doesn't really matter, because the result is that we're not effective because we're fighting each other as opposed to working together in some way. So this part I'll read a little bit from. This is from The Ungovernable Society, and
which he's got behind him by Grégoire something. Let me see. The Ungovernable Society. A Genealogy of Authoritarian Liberalism by Grégoire Chamaillou. I'll just write down the... It doesn't look like there's a full text one available, but, let's see... Sounds like... So that's where it's quoting from.
This discussion, and this is a good example because it talks about how counterinsurgency gets infused into stuff that people wouldn't think that it's infused in. So he uses this example that I think it was in the late 70s, early 80s. There was this global campaign against Nestle, because Nestle was creating, they had a baby formula that they were sending to the third world that...
I think that was more recent, actually. I remember that being a thing in the 90s, early 2000s. Like, when I started getting involved, politically involved, that was very much a thing, and that would have been, like, the late 90s.
If it wasn't properly, I think it had to be boiled for a certain amount of time or something.
Oh, this is a different thing. Okay, separate thing. I was thinking about the campaign because, like, Nestle and other formula companies would essentially discourage breastfeeding. So this sounds like it's actually something separate.
Like this, right? And so there were like chemicals within the baby formula that if it wasn't properly treated, that it would be poisonous to children, to babies. And they knew this, and a whole bunch of babies died because, maybe it wasn't communicated well enough to people, maybe there's a language barrier, maybe they just didn't have the resources to be able to process it the right way, and so on, right? But ultimately, Nestle should be held responsible for this, right? And so there's a global campaign to boycott them and, to try to get them to change their practices and all of this kind of stuff.
So there's a long tradition of boycotting Nestle, quite apart from the fact that their chocolate's shit.
And what do? Well, they hire a counterinsurgency expert. They hire somebody with, and this is, again, because counterinsurgency operates, they do, again, as I said before, things that they call psychological operations, which is like propaganda operations and so on. They want to distort or change the way people think about certain things is another way to think about what that means.
The Gormans are flouting imperial norms again. What is it with these Gormans and imperial norms?
So they hire this person, and a lot of times this is true. Like counterinsurgency people work for public relations firms, right? Because you can see the overlap there. If I want somebody to think differently about something, then I need to change the way they think, and so I need.
And this that is where Matthew Miller, the Count Smirkula from the U.S. State Department, is now working. He is working as a consultant at a crisis communications firm.
To study the psychology of people,
which is to say damage control.
How to manipulate. I mean, advertising is all filled with this stuff, right? Like, what is it that makes me want to buy this box of Wheaties? Like, they're thinking about that constantly. So they hire this person, and, you know, basically...
Well, it's because phonetically it makes me think maybe there might be weed in it.
Section in the chapter where it talks about basically... that their product is under attack by a plethora of public interest groups. And it says, who are these groups? It says, if you want to defeat them, you need to know them. But this is not complicated. They fall invariably into 4 main categories.
Oh, this is going to be the same thing I was talking about earlier with the chemical companies decades later, I think. This will be interesting.
Categories are the radicals, the opportunists, the idealists, and the realists. So I'll read you what it is written here about them.
Yeah, this is what I was trying to remember.
These want to change the system. They have underlying socio-economic, political motives, are hostile to enterprise as such, and may be extremist or violent.
Yes, I got a fucking problem with Captain Picard.
There is nothing to be done. The opportunists, these offer visibility, power, followers, and perhaps even employment. The key to dealing with opportunists is to provide them with at least the perception of a partial victory. The idealists, these people are usually naive and altruistic. They apply an ethical and moral standard. The problem with them is that they are sincere and, as a result, very credible. Except they are also very credulous. If it can be shown that their opposition to an industry or products causes harm to others and cannot be ethically justified, they are forced to change their position. I really want to come back to that one.
Yeah. I mean, and this one, you see, there's a lot of fucking discourse on Twitter that actually follows that particular model. I'm not saying that it is that it is, like, planned in that way, but I just can't help thinking there's a lot of discourse on Twitter that follows that exact model that he was just quoting right there.
At some point, because this is, to me, like...
the specific thing about how to deal with the idealists.
Liberals. Like, this is supporters of the Democratic Party in the United States. And then the realists, they are a godsend. They can live with trade-offs. They are willing to work within the system and want to work within the system. They are not interested in radical change, but are pragmatic. This is another form of liberals for sure. And so he lays this quick thing out. He said, faced with protests, the way forward is always the same: to negotiate with the realists, knowing that in most issues it is the solution agreed upon by the realists which is accepted, especially when business participates in the decision-making process.
Yeah.
Also,
this is, I mean, it's interesting because I remember not quite the same version. Yeah. Oh, I know where I read this now. There was this great book that I got as a birthday present several years ago about undercover operations against activists. And I believe it had included, because Monsanto's consultancy firm also followed basically this exact model. And the documents about that, the emails got leaked, and it was discussed in a chapter of this book.
The idealists need to be re-educated into realists, an educational process, according to Dutchin, which requires great sensitivity and understanding from the educator. If you can work with the realists and re-educate the idealists, they will switch over to your position. Once these critics of conscience have been turned, the radicals will lose the broad credibility that the support of these moral authorities has conferred upon them. Without support from the realists and idealists, the positions of radicals and opportunists are seen to be shallow and self-serving. At this point, you will always be able to count on the opportunists to accept the final compromise. And then at the end, they just sort of sum it by saying, such then is the general strategy.
Sounds very Palestinian Authority.
To cooperate with the realists, to converse with the idealists so as to convert them into realists, and to
turn them all against the radicals.
Isolate the radicals and gobble up the opportunists. Right. So this is like, again, that's like very 101. There's a lot of different versions of this, you know, but that gives an idea of how these people think about the psychology, really, of different types of people and how to manipulate them in order to win a kind of, you know, ideological war.
I mean, and you can, if you, like, pay attention to propaganda on any sort of topical issue, you can often see this sort of thing in real time. I mean, you'll find versions of this all over the place. And so it is a very useful frame to sort of keep in mind, particularly if you're talking about, like, these protests and this. I mean, at this point, it's, Uprising is beginning to feel like, I don't know, we're quite there in LA right now, but I feel like it's kind of moving in that direction. It's definitely kicking off. We will definitely be hearing versions of this kind of propaganda. Oh, hey. Oh, well, glad you've been lurking. I hope you've been enjoying it. I had this in my recommendations, and, you know, then LA happened, and it's like, well, this seems like the sort of thing we need to be talking about.
And have run a successful campaign. And in this case, it's just about, you know, Nestle and Monsanto or whatever.
Yeah, Monsanto is the other one. I mean, that is where I was introduced to it, because the consultants Monsanto had, like, 20 years later, had the same fundamental model.
These corporations,
And actually thinking about it, this goes back to something called the Mohawk Valley Formula, which was a first attempt at what was called scientific methods of strike breaking. One of Chomsky's interview compilations, he talks about it.
Little corporations trying to figure out how do we clean up our PR, and they're literally bringing in military counterinsurgency strategists to help them figure that out. So that's another thing I say that is, like, important to understand about not the conspiratorial thing is, like, no, like this is in the early 80s or late 70s.
And in the 90s and the 2000s. I mean, in the case of Monsanto. But it is time to wrap up. I'm going to just drop this link in chat once again in case anyone who came in after I dropped it the last time, because it definitely looks well worth watching the rest of. Thank you to everyone who joined in. It's always good to see you. I hope you enjoyed the stream. Fuerza, Elia. Just all my support to everybody in LA who is holding the line there against those fucking goons. And حتى النصر والتحرير.